Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Aspect Insights. This is episode 4. I'm your host, Alex Eagle. I'm the co-founder of Aspect. We make a monorepo developer platform based on Bazel. Care a lot about the Bazel ecosystem. Today, my guest is Brentley Jones to talk about what's new in Bazel 7.2. I'm pretty sure everybody who uses Bazel knows Brentley. He has always written the blog post about the new Bazel releases. Obviously, the Bazel team publishes a blog post, but when Brentley does it, it includes everything that's in there. And I often find that if I'm trying to remember which release this feature went in or what was new in Bazel 7, I go back and read what he wrote. He's a Bazel developer advocate and also has been really helpful in the Bazel community with the Rules Authors Special Interest Group. So super excited to welcome Brentley. How's it going? Yeah, of course. Thank you for doing this. So we've got a few things to talk about today, but I think probably the place to start is to fill in the background about how Bazel releases work in general. But before I do that, let me give you a chance to introduce yourself and what you've been up to lately. I understand you had a job switch.
Yeah, so I was at Build Buddy for 2 years, and that's where most people know me from. And recently I switched over to the iOS platform team at Reddit, specializing in, of course, build. Not much more to say about Reddit at this time, though, but you'll hear more about that in the future.
Cool. Well, it's really exciting that you're finding more places to bring the Bazel magic. Let's get into, I promised not to say in there. I did it already. I'm going to keep a counter in the back of my head. So for Bazel, let me present the release model page, and let's talk about this for a minute. How Bazel shows us the changes that they're making. They have a pretty interesting scheme for doing this that they came up with a couple of years ago, where changes are being made by Googlers regularly, and they're rolled out into every week's release of Blaze, which is what they call Bazel, and those are shipped as a full release with all of the latest changes from head every week. And that's the thing that you can get as a Bazel user. It's called the rolling release, and they're always tagged using the next major. So right now that's 8.0.0 something or other. Now there's a second a few of those changes that are really special can then be manually cherry-picked back to the release branch, and then those will come into the next Bazel 7 release. And tell us, Brentley does a lot of work actually tagging those things and bringing them back into the release branch. How's that been going?
For this last release, for like 7.0 and beyond, a lot better. There wasn't much of a good process around this for 6.0 and before. You could request them to be cherry picked, but there wasn't any automation, and they didn't actually have a fully staffed team to help out with that. They do now. They're very responsive. They're the ad triage team at GitHub, and cherry picks are really easy to get in now, which is good because it's a year between releases. So we try to get as many features into the major release, and then subsequently also into the minor releases if it's backwards compatible.
So do you have a take on like how well that release process is working? In particular, it feels like there are a lot of changes that land on head and go into the rolling release that ought to be part of the next minor. They're not breaking changes per semver, but then they don't make it into the releases, the next release. It feels like in some cases simply because it's too hard to do the cherry pick.
So some of it is that it's too hard to do the cherry pick. The other is that the visibility of changes that just make it into head versus that go through like GitHub pull requests. The visibility is just drastically decreased, and a lot of Googlers don't necessarily think about Bazel or Bazel releases. They're just getting the work done. So you actually have to notice them, or they have to be a prerequisite to another change that you want to cherry pick in for those ones usually to get picked. I'm pretty bad at that. I usually don't look at like the head releases or the head commits much. I'm all over the PRs, and that's where I request a lot of cherry pick. go through. But others like Fabian, also a build buddy now, he's pretty good at finding the ones that make sense to go into early candidate.
Yeah, great. Well, I think that probably covers that topic. But I should have mentioned at the beginning, since we're live, please do, if you have any questions for Brentley, put them in the comments and we can answer some of them while we're on for the next 24 minutes or so. So let's move on to, if we had this podcast a while ago, maybe for Bazel 7.1, we would have talked about what was going on in that release. And that's not our focus today, so let's not spend too much time on it. But there's a couple notable things that went into that release. Let me present the browser tab again with the release ticket here, so you can go back and look at this one to see what was in the release. This was the release process ticket, and then of course you can use the fantastic compare view on GitHub. I'm not sure if everyone is aware. If you go to GitHub, you can always hack the URL. So this is Bazel build /Bazel, and then I'm looking at /compare, and then some ref. In this case, it's a tag 702 ... 712. And this is a trick I've learned, is that if you have only two dots, so ... it will purely show you the delta of the code. But if you have 3 dots, put it back to ... then it shows you also the commits that landed in between the two. So I assume that Brentley spends a lot of time looking through that exact list. So walk us through what you thought from Bazel 7.1.
So couple big things. One is a big positive is that we got the compact execution log. So for people that don't know, before 7.1, if you could ask for Bazel to produce an execution log, and it would spit out a proto that had a lot of information, but each thing that it was in that log was every action that Bazel wanted to run, and either ran it, or if it was a cache hit, and it had all the information related to it, like inputs, outputs, environment variables, command line, which is especially useful when you're trying to debug remote cache hits, because you can kind of do one build with generating an execution log, do another one that should be all cache hits, but you're not getting all your cache hits. Look at that execution log, compare them, and see, well, what's different here? Where is my action key different? That thing was big, though. Massive. Like, people would get multi-gigabyte execution logs. This new compact execution log that Tiago worked on is I think it's like 1% the size, something like that, a lot smaller, and it has minimal overhead, like a couple percentage on CPU to generate as well. So that was a nice feature in 7.1.
Right. So from an end user's point of view, does that mean that it's now feasible to turn on the compact execution log for every build, rather than previously they probably were only turning on execution logs for select builds?
I think so. There's a little bit of an overhead, which is why that it's not enabled by default, and it doesn't, and potentially never will be. But I personally think that it's worth it, especially in 7.2, which we'll talk about in a bit. There's a change that makes it so that if you do enable it for every build, that it'll always be uploaded to your build event service, which just like having your timing profile always uploaded, allows for some nice analytics and introspection into your builds.
Yeah, okay, great. I should mention next week's show, Tiago will actually be joining us to talk about exactly this stuff, how the features in Bazel for gathering timing and logging. So we'll talk through that one some more. I know the next one on the list here for Bazel 7.1 I was excited about because it was an issue that I filed. I'm sure some other folks did too. 3645, which is about when you run Bazel inside of Docker, which I try not to do, but there's lots of cases where that's necessary. So of course, Bazel has a scheduler, which is trying to use heuristics to figure out how to pack work onto the local machine in the case of local actions or builds that don't have any RBE set up. And it tries to guess how much memory is on the machine, but if you're inside of a Docker container, there's some tricky bits in the Linux kernel that you need to use to correctly figure out how much memory there is. So essentially, it would assume that it had the entire machine. And so if you're using something like Kubernetes and you had several pods scheduled, several tasks scheduled on the same pod, then it would overestimate and run too many things. Probably I've already explained the thing there. Was there anything to add about what happened in 7.1?
No. I did have another thing that, while I think had good intentions, it landed kind of roughly in 7.1. And that's this experimental worker for repo fetching, which defaulted to auto, so basically defaulted on in 7.1. And the premise of this is that it'd be able to use virtual threads instead of real threads for repository fetching. And that's good, but the logic was a little flawed, and it really, led to some deadlocks. In particular, if you had an error during analysis, that was your main issue. So your build wouldn't have actually succeeded before anyway, but having it just hang there probably wasn't good. Fixes for that have been landed in 7.2 though, but it just kind of shows though a little bit of a flaw in the release process with LTS, in that since it's a year between releases, we really try to get in as many features or improvements as we can. And some of them, though, if not enough people are testing release candidates or enough are testing them at scale, breaking changes like this or regressions like this can make it into the final release.
Right. Okay. So just to repeat from my understanding, if you upgraded from 7.0 to 7.1, this flag would then flip and cause your build to hang where it used to fail?
Potentially, yeah. Basically, if you had a build that did succeed, it'd still probably succeed. There was only like certain conditions for the deadlock. The main condition was that if your build would have failed with a loading or analysis error, while repository fetching was happening, which would be like with SkyMild enabled, which is enabled by default with 7.0, then the deadlock was much more likely to happen.
Okay.
And unless you knew about this, like, you scour GitHub and stuff, you wouldn't understand why it was deadlocking,
Okay, cool. Well, that's actually a great segue, because we'll talk about 7.2, which is not released yet. We weren't sure if we would get the final release before Brentley and I came on to talk about it. And so it's currently at release candidate 2, and that begs the question, should folks be trying out Bazel release candidates?
Yes. Everyone, as soon as the release candidate 1 comes out, if you think you're going to be upgrading to that release, when it is properly released, you should be on the release candidate to begin with. There are numerous bugs that we're finding during the release candidate process. There's about 2 months between these minor releases, so it's ended up to be about 3 now, but we're aiming for 2, and a lot of changes going there. We could have potentially found the deadlocks in 7.1 if there was more people on the release candidates, for example.
Okay, so the request is to send a PR that tries bumping the .bazel version file and see what fails locally or on CI, or do you recommend actually upgrading to the RC and using that as the sort of source of?
I personally like where I've worked at before. We just bump it up as if 7.2 was out. We live on the release candidate, and like if there's bugs, we can roll back. But we treat it as the release, trying to do due diligence to report bugs.
Yeah, that's great. I think that ties into what we talked about last week with the Bazel community, where a lot of times people think contributions to a project only come in the form of commits, but this is actually a great way that everyone can contribute to Bazel, is by trying release candidates. Yes. So I agree. That's a great way to do it. If you are worried about having a release candidate be live for everybody in your repo, sending the pull request and at least trying one build on it will catch a lot of the issues too.
Yep, and you also, you get to know like what you're gonna have to do once the release actually comes out. In case you do have to do some migrations.
Right, exactly. It's almost any work that you have to do is not sunk cost, because you're going to need to upgrade Bazel eventually.
Related to that, though, the roll-in releases, which you mentioned, earlier. I mean, now we're kind of in the middle. We're kind of halfway towards 8, so now it's probably not a time where people are going to be thinking about it unless they're seeing some changes that are non-backwards compatible and aren't able to be cherry picked into the 7.0 LTS. But when it gets closer to the time that like 8 is going to come out, and before the release candidates are made, I recommend people jumping on the rolling releases and doing a similar thing. It's kind of hard to live on the rolling releases. They are very rough. It's pretty much a fire hose. Lots of break-in changes. You basically have to do many migrations a year versus one. But I recommend the same thing, especially towards around BazelCon time, is kind of jumping on that off of the LTS train.
Yeah, that one is also useful for rules authors because a lot of times when you jump to the rolling releases, you'll discover bugs that aren't in Bazel, but in some rule set that you use. And rules authors are maybe not doing that kind of testing themselves and relying on users to report those.
Yeah, for rules authors, I recommend they have a CI track that literally points to last screen. That can be rough as well, depending on your rules. But you at least know about changes and can report bugs quickly as well. Because if you're living on head, you can report issues that Google doesn't see internally, but the community does.
All right, cool. Well, let's get to our main topic then. Bazel 7.2. There's a lot of good stuff in here that folks should be excited about. Here's the release, the process ticket. I think if you find a bug in 7.2, this is the place to come and report it. Is that right?
Sort of. You should file a normal issue, and then most likely someone will come in and tag it. There's like a chat command you can do that then ends up creating a new issue they have issues specific to release blockers. Sometimes you can report stuff here, but I think the preferred process is you file as a separate issue.
Okay, makes sense. And so same as last time, we've got this nice giant list of commits.
Lots of them this time.
Yes, lots of commits. So it says at the top we have 151 commits and 764 files changed. So do you want to tell us about each and every one of them?
I could probably do that, more towards when 8.0 is actually being released if I end up doing another blog post. But I have a couple here that I think are important to talk about. The first was, we mentioned the deadlocks are fixed. So if you're experiencing those, jump on the release candidate and hopefully those are resolved for you. A feature that's made it in, and it's been kind of it's been in PR form for a while. Ed opened it a long time ago, was the remote output service. They talked about it at the last BazelCon, and it has made it into 7.2. The big thing for that is that it will allow you to run like a sidecar daemon that uses Fuse or NFS, to kind of virtualize your like remote cache or remote execution, and makes it so instead of using build without the bytes, like nothing is ever downloaded, and then when you try to access the file, it just fetches it from the remote cache. So you don't have to know ahead of time like what you're going to want to have on disk at the end of the build. You'll just try to access it.
Yeah, internally at Google, they had this feature forever. I remember it was like 2012. Milos Vesta was the TL for this system called ObjFS. Mm-hmm. And at Google, they love to write custom Fuse file systems and then roll it out like to everybody's corporate machines. Like I feel like they probably even have kernel level access to what's running in there. But yeah, exactly. It looked as if all of Bazel out is present, even though you didn't download any of it, which is great. Yeah, that's a great middle ground. I remember Ed's feature has been out for, it was like a year or more that he had that PR up, right?
Yeah, I think it was about 2 years. I remember it was a patch against 5.1 or something like that to begin with.
And if I remember correctly, I think the folks at Marathon did a lot of work to then pick it up and get it across the finish line. So big thanks to them.
And then Chi internally at Google helped as well to adjust it a little bit more, because I think they're trying to align it with the Google 3 implementation as well.
Yeah, that's great. So thanks to all those folks. So let's talk about Bazel mod a little bit. That's been a little bit of a rough landing. I know that we've recommended most people turn off the Bazel dot module, the module.bazel.lock file, or at least not check it in. What's the update there?
Yeah, so thanks to Fabian, there's a new format for the lock file that is much more friendly to Git merging. It's very similar to the Go lock file format, where I think it's like basically append only unless you want to refresh it. So I think after this, we'll finally be able to recommend people not Git ignore it and start checking it in.
Right. So the merge conflicts will be easier to resolve manually. Is there also sort of a feature where Bazel itself can repair a merge conflict?
I haven't looked enough into that to know.
Okay.
I know there's a new command for refresh as well. So.
Yeah, my understanding was that so in Git you can specify a custom merge driver, which is a little fancy. It requires everybody in the repo to add a setting to their local Git config, and that merge driver can then find merge conflict regions and repair them
I
automatically.
remember seeing that. Yep.
But I think that's not out yet.
Yeah, there's work on that again by Fabian.
Okay. Yeah, and then the other reason that people had to Git ignore the lock file. Oh no, sorry, different topic. The module.bazel file gets really huge, so I think that's also been improved upon.
Yeah, there's this new include directive that allows you to kind of split it up, very similar to like Workspace, where you could load in BZL files. So yes, you're now finally able to split that up, which is really good for repos that have code ownership over different dependencies, and you want to lock those to specific files.
Yep, that's great. The next one that I'm interested in is the modify execution info flag, because Aspect has a helper library, Bazel lib, and we've often recommended that users do things like tell the tar action to run non-remote or something. But as soon as you add that flag, then it clobbered any earlier instances of that flag, which seemed completely crazy. I know you filed this issue forever ago.
Yeah, way back in 4.0. So.
So yeah, what's the update there? Is that fixed now?
Yeah, there's a new incompatible flag that you can flip that makes it so it's additive. So yes. I mean, it's technically a break and change. So, people are relying on it. But I do believe with 8 that can be flipped. So, people can get over it.
Okay. So now there's 701 flags.
Yeah.
Is the joke. Okay. Well, at least it's fixable. So I suppose we should let everyone know, maybe in the show notes, what the incompatible flag is that you ought to flip so that you stop having the modify execution info foot gun in your build. Oh, yes, I see. Of course, it's breaking because now all of your modify execution infos will be honored where they weren't before.
Yeah.
Okay, well, that's valid. Let's see, which one do you want to talk about next? I know we have a few other topics here.
Yeah. So maybe we talk about the one that almost made it and hopefully is coming soon.
Yeah.
So there's been a long how old is this? This one's even longer than any of the other feature requests. It's ancient for the disk cache that Bazel supports to have garbage collection. So Diego is working on finally enabling that for us, and it was slated for 7.2. It just missed the cut though, so we're hoping that 7.3 is when we finally have garbage collection for Git disk cache. But also, it seems like we're going to be getting garbage collection for the repository cache and the install base as well. So there's a lot of companies deal with this issue for like local developers where they use Bazel and they don't want to tell people to run Bazel clean because that's an anti-pattern. Like you should just be able to build, but it just never cleans up after itself. There's just so many blobs that end up everywhere on your disk, and so these garbage collection features are going to be a big improvement for people. They can get rid of their little scripts so they go, oh, if you're under 10 gigabytes of disk space, let's clean out our Bazel caches.
Yeah, and I've seen there's a lot of tricky concurrency issues to deal with here, so it requires a lot of care. I think Also kind of interesting, like why would these bugs be in Bazel if Google's been using it since 2007 or something? And I think the answer there is that they've had the remote execution and remote cache wired up for local developer builds forever-ish, because they only allow developers to work on Linux essentially. So they have a single platform, which makes it easier to share the cache hits. They have a closet in each office essentially that has a local replica of the remote cache to make it incredibly high bandwidth for those to be on developers' machines. And so they simply never had a use for the disk cache or some of these other caches internally at Google. And so we only see them when we get it out to the Bazel community.
Yep. Another one is, it's just a small little change, but I think it's on a theme that I think we really need to improve on with Bazel. So Fabian put in a change that added a did you mean this flag for unknown, or this command, or this flag? I forget which one it is for unknown flags. I think it's flag. And this improves the UX around using Bazel, and I think we have a long way to go there. I think it's not kind of hard. It's really hard for new people to use Bazel, especially when they encounter errors. So anything we can do to help around explaining errors, compile errors, where to go, what to change, how to modify star alert, things in that vein are good.
Yeah, just this week I pointed one of my coworkers to an issue where Bazel can suggest maybe you meant Java library, but it doesn't know how to say maybe you meant Swift library, because one of them's built in and the other one's not.
Yeah. Once all the rules are out, I think out of Bazel core, I think we'll have hooks to be able to make those changes, or sadly we'll lose that for a time being.
Yeah, well, for a long time that was true for flags like test lang filters only supported built-in langs, but that one's already been fixed. Nice. So yeah, there's just a long pile of those things to burn through.
Yeah, and then I just had one more that I kind of wanted to do a call out for. So Pedro at Google has been working on speeding up sandboxing, in particular for Mac OS, and some of his changes have landed in 7.2 as well, in particular around sandbox reuse. There's a flag you can set to have the sandboxes reused.
Yeah, my understanding there is that Mac OS just doesn't have the same performance for the primitives that are used for sandboxing that Linux does. And also scary, I remember last BazelCon, someone pointed out that Apple is planning to deprecate the primitive that is currently used for the Mac OS sandbox. Do you know what's going on with that?
So it's been deprecated for a couple of years, but I wouldn't be too worried about it because Swift Package Manager it uses the same sandboxing now. So we'll see when there's a replacement for it, because Swift Package Manager is open source. So as soon as they have to migrate to something else, we'll be able to as well. So I
see.
I think
I didn't realize Swift Package Manager is maintained by Apple, and so they have to do both.
Yep.
Okay. Oh, that's a relief. If Apple themselves depend on it, then yeah, they can't break us at the drop of a hat. Yep. It'd be exciting to have the sandbox be faster. I have to recommend for some of our clients that they just turn off sandboxing, right? Use strategy local or strategy standalone. I think local is preferred, right?
Yeah, most iOS development doesn't run with sandboxing, at least for local dev. Like CI, we can enable it, but no, it's way too slow for local development.
Yeah. Okay, well, awesome. Thank you for walking us through those. I'll put you on the spot for a second, because when I did the intro, I pointed out that I always go and read your blog posts about what was new in Bazel 7. And it seems like you must put a lot of work into that. Are you going to do that again for Bazel 8?
Yeah, honestly, I'm not sure yet. So it is a lot of work. It was around 2 weeks of work last time. But maybe I don't need to spend as much time on it. But I also don't have direct sponsorship for it currently, so we'll see what happens.
All right. Well, let's have a chat with the Bazel team. It does feel a little silly that they put up a blog post that has not enough info, and then you're forced to find some third-party place to post the blog post that should have been. Maybe we can even get them on the same spot.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah. All right. Well, Bazel 8 will be here in the fall. Maybe we'll get back together and chat about chat about the updates that when that's out, or at least when it's in release candidate and everyone is trying it, like you suggested.
Yeah, sounds good.
Okay, well, I think we've reached the end of our time. Anything else you wanted to mention?
No, it's been fun talking to you about this.
Yeah, well, it's been fun learning about it. Thank you so much for coming on and telling everybody about Bazel 7.2. And we'll see you all next week. We're going to have, like we mentioned, Tiago Calhas from the Bazel team. Very excited to hear more about what he has to say. So until next time, thanks, Brentley.
Thanks.